The very first thing we need to do to define a custom entity is to create a new staging table for that entity. Let me start by showing you how to create a staging table that will be used to import sites using the data import-export framework. For this demo, I'm going to use the create entity wizard. This creates a basic template for the custom entity, which we can then customize more. Once I create the basic template using the wizard, I will show you the properties that have been set on the staging table so that you can further customize them if needed. We are in the data import-export framework module. Within that, we're going to click on the create custom entity for data import-export. This launches the create entity wizard. Let's click on next. And the entity that we're going to create is based on the invent sites table. So let's select that. And click on next. Here you can see that you can specify a few properties for the entity. The name of the entity, for the staging table, the entity query name, and the entity class name. These the names generated by the wizard look okay, so we're going to leave them as is. Next, we can select the display menu item name for this particular entity. There is already one that's in AX, which we can use, so we're going to use the invent site display menu item. Then you have the ability to use either a method or query for any fields that are there which have foreign key references. In our case, we're going to use generate from method. So I'm going to select that. And the last option that we have here is whether this entity is a composite entity. If we select this option, then the framework will generate a row ID column in the staging database, staging table, which we can use to map the rows between related entities. The invent site entity we're creating is not a composite entity, and so we're going to leave that blank. Let's click on next. Here you can select the fields in the target table that you want to be generated into the staging table. We want to use all of the fields from the target table in the staging table. So I'm going to leave the selections as is to select all of the fields and then click on next. We are now done with specifying the basic information needed to create an entity. Let's click finish to have the wizard generate the AOT artifacts. Here you might get a dialog to add the foreign key relationships to the current table. We're going to click on next for this dialog. The wizard then creates a project called the DMF invent site entity, which contains all of the AOT elements that make up this entity. Okay, so now let's look at the project that's been created. I'm going to open the development workspace and open the project again. To do that, I'm going to go to the Windows and New Development Workspace, and then open the Projects window. There's a private project called the DMF invent site entity. I'm going to open that. You'll notice that there are a few objects in this project. Under classes, we have the DMF invent site entity class. Then we have the DMF invent site entity site target entity, which is a query. And then under tables, we have the DMF invent site entity table. In this lesson, we'll take a deeper look at just the staging table. We'll look at the entity class and the target query in later chapters. Let's open the DMF invent site entity table and look at the properties that have been set. In the property sheet for the DMF invent site entity, there are a set of properties that need to be set. The first property that needs to be set is the save data per company. You need to set that to no. You also need to set the support inheritance property to no. The table type for this table is a regular table, and the configuration key is DMF. The last property that we also need to make sure is set is the valid time state property. Valid time state field type, that's also set to none. A staging table must also have a set of fields that are required by the data import export framework. Let's take a look at these fields. You'll notice that there are a number of fields in this particular table. Some of these are standard fields that are used by the data import export framework. The definition group field, which is based off of the DMF definition group name EDT, is used for the processing group. Then we have a field called the isSelected field, which uses the DMF isSelected EDT, which is basically a no-yes enum. And then this field is used by the data import export framework to mark whether a record is marked for migration from staging to target or not. Then you have the transfer status field, which uses the DMF transfer status enum. This captures the status of the transfer and if there are any errors that have occurred. And then finally we have the execution ID field, which uses the DMF execution ID EDT. This field basically identifies the staging execution ID. Then beyond the fields that have been that are standard with the framework, you can also create all of the other fields from your target entity into the staging table. So for instance, you have on the site you have fields like name, site ID, branch code, and so on. These are all related to the invent site table, and they've been added to this particular staging table. Next, we need to create a set of field groups that are used by the data import export framework. The first field group we'll talk about is the exclusion list field group. These to this list, add the fields that are excluded from your migration. You can see that the standard fields like the definition group, execution ID, isSelected, and transfer status are already added to this execution list. You can also optionally add another field group called enabled, where you can add the fields that should be included in your template by default. Then you need to create a set of field groups, one for each method that the entity class is going to use to perform transformations. For instance, in the invent site entity, we have two methods that will be part of the entity class: the generate default dimension method and the generate tax branch rec ID method. The first method is going to use set the default dimension on the invent site, and the second one is going to set the tax branch rec ID. The method on the entity class for generating the default dimension requires a parameter called the default dimension, and so all of the parameters that method requires need to be added to this field group. Similarly, the tax branch rec ID method requires the tax branch code which is added as a parameter to that method, and so we add that field into the field group here. You'll also notice that there's a number next to the field group. This number denotes the sequence in which these methods are run. Next, we need to define the primary index for this staging table. You can name this anything, but it needs to have, at a minimum, the execution ID and the definition group and any fields that make this particular index unique. Also, be sure to set on the index properties that say allow duplicates to no and the alternate key to yes. And finally, we need to create a relationship between the staging table and the target table. Here we have created one relationship called invent site. This allows you to navigate from a record in the staging table to the target table record. So you can see that in DMF invent site entity.siteid equals invent site.siteid. With that, we've completed creating a staging table for our custom entity. As you have seen, the create entity wizard can help you create a base entity and set up all of the AOT objects that you need to get started with creating the custom entity. The wizard also sets up properties and fields on the staging table that are needed by the data import-export framework. In the next lesson, we'll talk about creating the target query.